While walking past Buckingham Palace, a CEO was caught off guard when he heard a royal guard fluently speaking Mandarin, then switching effortlessly to Spanish, then French. By the time the guard revealed he spoke 9 languages, the CEO was so impressed he offered him £1 million on the spot. But what the guard said in return left everyone stunned. Want to know how the entire moment unfolded? Be sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the full story. London's early morning mist wrapped around Buckingham Palace like a gossamer veil, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as the first light of dawn pierced through the overcast sky. The familiar ritual was about to begin, the changing of the guard ceremony that drew thousands of visitors from every corner of the globe. Among the growing crowd of spectators stood Marcus Blackwood, a distinguished gentleman in his mid-50s, whose impeccably tailored charcoal suit and platinum cufflinks spoke of considerable wealth and influence. Blackwood was the founder and chairman of Meridian Industries, a conglomerate that had grown from a small import business into a global powerhouse spanning 4 continents. His sharp gray eyes, which had assessed countless boardrooms and negotiation tables, surveyed the scene with the detached interest of someone accustomed to observing human behavior for strategic advantage. He had arrived in London from Dubai just hours earlier, his private jet touching down at Heathrow as the city still slept. The morning walk hadn't been planned. Blackwood's usual routine involved going straight from airport to hotel to meeting, but jet lag had left him restless, and his first appointment wasn't until 10 o'clock. The palace grounds offered a momentary escape from the relentless pace of international commerce, though even now his mind was occupied with the upcoming merger discussions that could reshape his company's presence in European markets. The ceremonial guard stood in perfect formation, their scarlet tunics brilliant against the gray morning, their burskin caps adding an imposing height to already impressive figures. To the casual observer, they appeared identical silent sentinels maintaining an ancient tradition with mechanical precision. But among their ranks stood Lance Corporal David Chen, a young man whose story would prove far more remarkable than his stoic exterior suggested. At 27, Chen had already served 6 years with the Welsh Guards, though his journey to this prestigious position had been anything but conventional. Born in Hong Kong to a British father and Chinese mother, he had spent his childhood moving between cultures and languages with the fluid adaptability that would later define his adult life. His father's diplomatic career had taken the family to 7 different countries before David's 18th birthday, each posting adding new layers to his linguistic foundation. The ceremony commenced with its familiar pageantry, the military band's brass instruments echoing across the courtyard in ceremonial splendor. Blackwood sipped coffee from a disposable cup, purchased from a nearby vendor who had recognized wealth when he saw it, and charged accordingly. The businessman checked his platinum Patek Philippe watch 25 minutes until his driver would arrive for the meeting with potential German investors. The disruption began suddenly and with unmistakable urgency. Near the front of the assembled crowd, an elderly gentleman in an expensive overcoat began speaking rapidly in what Blackwood immediately recognized as Italian, though the man's distress made his words tumble together in an almost incomprehensible stream of panic and frustration. Il mio documento non riesco a trovare il mio passaporto diplomatico e scomparso. The man's voice carried the particular note of panic that comes when important people find themselves in impossible situations. Several tourists turned to stare, some fumbling with translation applications on their phones, others simply recording the scene for social media. The man was clearly someone of importance. His bearing, his clothes, the way he carried himself, all suggested diplomatic status. Blackwood recognized the type from countless international conferences and state dinners. This was potentially a significant incident in the making, the kind of cultural embarrassment that could make headlines, if not handled properly. And then something extraordinary happened that would change the trajectory of multiple lives. Lance Corporal Chen, who had been standing motionless in the front rank of guards, turned his head with the slightest possible movement toward the commotion. For several seconds, he remained perfectly still, his trained ears processing not just the words, but the cultural context, the level of formality, the specific regional dialect that would determine the most appropriate response. Then, in a voice that carried across the morning air with calm authority and perfect pronunciation, he spoke. Stia tranquillo, Excellenza. La aiuteremo a ritrovare il suo documento. Può descrivermi quando I dove l'ha visto l'ultima volta. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Italian diplomat he clearly was stopped speaking mid-sentence, his eyes widening in astonishment. The surrounding crowd fell silent, their attention shifting from the distressed man to the guard who had just demonstrated flawless Italian with what sounded like a Roman accent and appropriate diplomatic honorifics. Blackwood's coffee cup remained suspended halfway to his lips as his mind processed what he had just witnessed. In 3 decades of international business, he had encountered many polyglots. But this was different. The guard hadn't simply translated or spoken Italian, he had demonstrated cultural fluency, using formal address appropriate for someone of diplomatic rank, speaking with natural rhythm and intonation that suggested deep familiarity with the language. The diplomat, whom Blackwood now recognized as Ambassador Giuseppe Marcelli from a recent trade summit in Brussels, began responding in rapid Italian. Chen listened with complete attention while maintaining his ceremonial posture, occasionally nodding almost imperceptibly, then provided what appeared to be detailed instructions. Within moments, palace security had been discreetly contacted, and an organized search for the missing diplomatic passport was underway. What struck Blackwood most profoundly wasn't just the linguistic ability, but the way Chen managed to provide high-level diplomatic assistance while never breaking character or abandoning his ceremonial responsibilities. Most people would have stepped out of formation, made a show of their helpfulness, drawn attention to their unique abilities. This guard was solving an international incident while maintaining the disciplined composure that his position demanded. The search proceeded with military efficiency, coordinated between Chen's continued conversation with the ambassador and the palace security team's systematic investigation of the area. Blackwood found himself studying the guard with the intensity of a collector who had discovered a rare artifact. In his world, linguistic expertise wasn't just valuable, it was often the difference between success and failure. In negotiations worth hundreds of millions of pounds, every major deal that had collapsed due to cultural misunderstandings, every contract that had failed because of translation errors, every relationship that had soured because of linguistic insensitivity, all of it could have been prevented with the right cultural expertise. And here, standing in ceremonial dress at Buckingham Palace, was someone who appeared to possess exactly that kind of rare capability. After 15 minutes of careful searching, a security officer approached with a diplomatic passport that had been discovered near the Victoria Memorial, apparently dropped during the ambassador's morning photography session. Ambassador Marcelli's relief was palpable as he thanked Chen profusely in Italian, his gratitude flowing in eloquent phrases that demonstrated his own considerable linguistic sophistication. Chen's response was brief, formal, and perfectly calibrated to the diplomatic context. He expressed satisfaction that the matter had been resolved, wished the ambassador well for the remainder of his visit, and then seamlessly returned to his ceremonial position as if nothing unusual had occurred. The crowd began to disperse, many tourists taking photographs and discussing what they had witnessed in dozens of different languages. But Blackwood remained rooted to his position, his business instincts firing with an intensity he hadn't experienced in years. He pulled out his phone and dialed his personal assistant in London. "Jennifer, I need you to research something for me immediately. The guards at Buckingham Palace specifically. I need information about one who speaks Italian. Yes, I'm entirely serious. I need everything you can find within the next hour. And I need it to be comprehensive." As the ceremony concluded and the guards began their precisely choreographed return to Wellington Barracks, Blackwood followed at a respectful distance. His business meeting with the German investors suddenly seemed far less important than the opportunity that had just presented itself. Every instinct honed by decades of recognizing valuable assets was telling him that he had just witnessed something potentially transformative for his company's international operations. Jennifer's return call came as he positioned himself in St. James's Park with a clear view of the barracks entrance. "Sir, I've been making inquiries through my contacts at the Ministry of Defense. The guard you're interested in is likely Lance Corporal David Chen of the Welsh Guards. According to my sources, he's considered one of their most exceptional soldiers, with an unusual educational and cultural background." "How unusual?" Blackwood asked, settling onto a park bench and canceling his morning meeting with a quick text to his driver. "Well, he was born in Hong Kong, but educated internationally due to his father's diplomatic career. He studied applied linguistics and international relations at Cambridge, graduating with first-class honors. What makes this interesting is that he turned down multiple offers from prestigious consulting firms and the Foreign Office to pursue military service instead. Blackwood felt his pulse accelerate. A Cambridge graduate with first-class honors who had chosen military service over lucrative civilian opportunities suggested either exceptional personal principles or someone with a very different understanding of value and success than most people in his social circle. What do you know about his language capabilities? This is where it becomes fascinating, sir. My contact mentioned that he frequently serves as an unofficial cultural liaison during state visits and diplomatic functions. He's reportedly fluent in at least 8 languages, possibly more. There are stories about him being called upon to handle sensitive translation work during high-level meetings. 8 languages, minimum. Blackwood calculated quickly. Meridian Industries employed dozens of translators and cultural consultants across their global operations, paying them collectively millions of pounds annually. Most specialized in 2 or 3 languages at most, and even the best rarely combined linguistic ability with genuine cultural insight. Someone with Chen's apparent capabilities, combined with Cambridge-level education and military discipline, would be worth a fortune in the corporate world. The break period arrived at precisely 1100 hours, military punctuality being as reliable as atomic clocks. Blackwood had been waiting for nearly 2 hours, ignoring increasingly urgent messages from his assistant about rescheduled meetings and frustrated German investors. When Chen emerged from the barracks in casual military attire, Blackwood approached with the calculated confidence that had served him well in countless high-stakes negotiations. "Lance Corporal Chen," he said, extending a business card with his company's distinctive gold embossing. "Marcus Blackwood, Meridian Industries. I witnessed your assistance to Ambassador Marcelli this morning. Quite remarkable work." Chen paused, accepting the card with polite wariness. Up close, Blackwood could see intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog and assess everything around them with military precision. This wasn't someone who missed details or failed to recognize underlying motivations. "Thank you, sir. I'm pleased we could resolve the ambassador's difficulties." The accent was educated and refined, clearly Cambridge trained, but underneath it Blackwood detected subtle influences that suggested exposure to multiple linguistic environments. This was someone who didn't just speak multiple languages, he thought in them. "Your Italian is exceptional. I'm curious, how many languages do you actually speak?" Chen glanced at his watch, noting that he had exactly 27 minutes of authorized break time remaining. Military precision extended to every aspect of his life. "I'm fluent in 8, conversational in 5 others." The casual nature of the response nearly staggered Blackwood. 13 languages. In the international business world, someone with that level of capability would command salaries in the high 6 figures, possibly 7. And here was this man, standing in Wellington Barracks in standard military dress, probably earning less in a year than Blackwood spent on his wine collection. 8 fluently, Blackwood repeated, working to keep his voice steady. "Which 8? English, Mandarin, Cantonese, Italian, French, German, Spanish, and Arabic. The others depend on context and necessity." Blackwood felt like a prospector who had just discovered a gold vein. These weren't just languages, they were keys to entire economic regions, cultural contexts, negotiation frameworks. Someone who could navigate seamlessly between English and Mandarin, Arabic and German. Italian and Spanish wasn't just a translator. They were a cultural architect, a diplomatic asset, a competitive advantage that typically couldn't be purchased at any price. "Lance Corporal, I'm going to make you a proposition. That might sound unconventional," Blackwood said, pulling out his phone to access his digital contract templates. "I'd like to offer you a position with my company, Senior Director of Global Cultural Strategy, £1.2 million annually, plus comprehensive benefits, plus equity participation." Chen didn't respond with the amazement or excitement that Blackwood had anticipated. Instead, he seemed to consider the offer with the same measured assessment he had shown during the passport incident, weighing factors that extended far beyond monetary considerations. "That's quite generous, Mr. Blackwood, but I have obligations here that take precedence." "Obligations?" Blackwood pressed, genuinely puzzled. "Lance Corporal, with all due respect, you're probably earning what, £35,000 annually? Perhaps 40 with your rank and experience. I'm offering you 30 times that amount. The financial aspect isn't the primary concern, sir." This response stopped Blackwood completely. In his extensive experience, everyone had motivational triggers. Not always monetary. Some people sought power, others craved recognition. Some valued security above all else, but everyone wanted something enough to alter their life's trajectory. Here was a man who had just been offered generational wealth and seemed genuinely unaffected by it. Then what is the primary concern? Chen gestured toward the palace, its familiar silhouette visible through the park's trees. I have duties until 1600 hours today. Tomorrow I have training exercises from 0600 to 1800. This weekend I have ceremonial responsibilities for a state dinner. My service commitment has 2 years and 4 months remaining. The simplicity of the statement was profound. Blackwood had negotiated with heads of multinational corporations, convinced billionaires to merge their companies, persuaded venture capitalists to fund seemingly impossible ventures, but he had never encountered someone who seemed so genuinely detached from personal financial gain. You do understand, Blackwood said carefully, that with your linguistic abilities and educational background, you could command virtually any salary you desired in the private sector, international consulting, diplomatic service, corporate strategy. The entire world would compete for your services. Yes, sir, I'm fully aware of those possibilities. Then why are you here? Chen looked back toward the barracks, where other soldiers were visible through the windows, some engaged in maintenance duties, others studying manuals, all maintaining the quiet discipline that defined their professional lives. Mr. Blackwood, when I was 14 years old, my family was living in Singapore during my father's posting there. I attended an international school where most students came from wealthy expatriate families. I was one of the few scholarship students, certainly the only one whose parents had worked multiple jobs to afford the additional expenses that weren't covered by the diplomatic education allowance. Blackwood listened, recognizing the careful cadence of someone who had reflected deeply on their life choices. Over many years, the other students had advantages I couldn't match: family connections, cultural capital, economic security that extended back generations. What I had was an aptitude for languages and a work ethic that my parents had instilled through their own example. My mother spoke Cantonese and English. My father spoke Mandarin and French from his university years. When we moved between countries, I realized that languages weren't just academic subjects, they were survival tools that could open doors or close them depending on your level of mastery. The narrative was emerging with the kind of thoughtful detail that suggested years of self-examination and philosophical consideration. By the time I reached Cambridge, I was fluent in 6 languages and conversational in 4 others. My professors assumed I would pursue academic research or join the diplomatic service. The logical progression would have been the Foreign Office, where my capabilities would have guaranteed rapid advancement and considerable influence in international affairs. So why didn't you follow that path? Because logic doesn't account for everything, Mr. Blackwood. During my final year at Cambridge, I attended a memorial service for British soldiers who had died in Afghanistan. I watched the honor guard, observed the precision of their movements, witnessed the way they embodied service above self-interest. I realized that everything I had achieved, my education, my opportunities, my freedom to choose my own destiny, existed because other people had made sacrifices to protect those possibilities. Blackwood found himself genuinely moved by the explanation, though his business instincts continued calculating the potential value of such principled thinking. When properly channeled, the military offered me something that civilian careers couldn't provide, Chen continued. Purpose that transcended personal advancement, the discipline to excel not for individual benefit, but as part of something larger and more enduring. When I stand guard at the palace, I'm not merely performing a job by maintaining a tradition that represents stability, continuity, and selfless service to something greater than myself. But surely, Blackwood argued, you could serve your country just as effectively in a civilian capacity. Your linguistic abilities could advance British interests through diplomatic channels, international business relationships, cultural exchange programs that shape global understanding. Perhaps, but service isn't simply about maximizing your individual contribution to society. It's about understanding your role within a larger structure, accepting that personal desires are secondary to collective responsibility and shared obligations. The conversation was unlike any negotiation Blackwood had ever experienced. Usually, when he offered someone life-changing compensation, the discussion immediately shifted to terms, conditions, starting dates, and implementation details. Here, he was receiving a philosophical education from someone who seemed genuinely immune to financial temptation. Let me present this differently, Blackwood said, changing his approach entirely. What happens when your military service concludes? You can't maintain ceremonial duties indefinitely. I'll reassess my options at that time. Perhaps diplomatic service, possibly international education, potentially development work in regions where linguistic skills can bridge cultural divides. The languages will always be valuable tools, but they're means to an end, not ends in themselves. And if I told you that you could achieve more positive impact through my company's resources than you ever could as an individual soldier. We operate in 57 countries, employ over 80,000 people, influence policy at governmental levels. Your linguistic and cultural expertise could reshape how Western businesses engage with emerging markets, how international partnerships are structured, how cultural barriers are systematically overcome. For the first time, Chen seemed genuinely intrigued by the proposition. Blackwood recognized the shift. He had found an angle that resonated with the man's values, rather than his personal ambitions. What specific type of work would that involve? Blackwood pulled up his phone and began showing Chen examples of recent company projects. 3 months ago, we lost a £3 billion infrastructure contract in the Middle East because our negotiation team completely misunderstood a cultural reference that fundamentally altered the meaning of a crucial proposal section. The month before that, a joint venture with a Chinese manufacturing consortium collapsed when our translators failed to recognize the subtle but critical differences between formal and informal communication protocols. The examples were clearly having an effect. Chen was asking pointed questions about the specific cultural contexts, suggesting alternative approaches, identifying the systematic problems that had led to these costly failures. The fundamental issue isn't translation, Chen observed, it's cultural fluency. Most international businesses treat language as a technical skill, like engineering or financial analysis, but language is inseparable from worldview, from relationship dynamics, from historical context and power structures that shape how people think and communicate. Exactly, Blackwood said, sensing a breakthrough. That's precisely why I need someone with your background and perspective. Not just someone who can translate words accurately, but someone who can navigate cultural contexts, anticipate potential misunderstandings, build bridges between fundamentally different ways of thinking and conducting business. After several minutes of consideration, Chen asked, Mr. Blackwood, if I were to consider such a position, and I want to emphasize that I'm not committing to anything, what would be the practical requirements and expectations? The question sent Blackwood's pulse racing. This was the first clear indication that his offer might be seriously considered. Despite the philosophical obstacles, extensive travel, obviously, you'd spend approximately half your time overseas, working directly with our international partners and cultural stakeholders. The remainder would be London-based, developing cultural strategy frameworks, training our negotiation teams, reviewing contracts and proposals for cultural sensitivity and appropriateness. And the timeline for implementation? I'd want you to begin as soon as your military obligations permit. We have major expansions planned for Southeast Asian and Middle Eastern markets, and your language abilities would be invaluable for those initiatives. Chen was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing considerations that extended far beyond career advancement and financial gain. Blackwood waited patiently, recognizing that this wasn't a moment for pressure tactics or aggressive persuasion. Finally, Chen spoke. Mr. Blackwood, I'll consider your offer seriously, but I have conditions that would be absolutely non-negotiable. The word conditions in a salary negotiation typically meant the deal was progressing toward acceptance. Blackwood tried to contain his excitement while maintaining professional composure. I'm listening. First, I maintain my military commission and ceremonial obligations, 10 shifts per month minimum, with my service commitments taking absolute precedence over all other responsibilities. The requirement was unusual, but not impossible to accommodate. In fact, Blackwood realized, having an employee who maintained active military status might actually be beneficial for certain international contracts, particularly in regions where military service commanded high respect. That could be arranged. What else? Second, I have complete authority over cultural strategy decisions. If I determine that a business practice or negotiation approach is culturally inappropriate or potentially offensive, my judgment is final and cannot be overruled by business considerations. This was more challenging, as Blackwood was accustomed to making all strategic decisions himself. However, he recognized that cultural expertise was meaningless if it could be superseded by short-term financial considerations. Agreed. with the understanding that we'd establish clear protocols for such situations. Third, I want equity participation. That vests over 8 years, not the standard 3 or 4. I'm not interested in short-term financial gains. If I'm going to help build something meaningful, I want to be invested in its long-term success and sustainability. The final condition revealed a sophisticated understanding of corporate structure that impressed Blackwood considerably. This wasn't someone who could be bought with immediate gratification. He was thinking strategically about value creation and long-term organizational alignment. Agreed, Blackwood said, extending his hand. When could you potentially begin? I'll need to review complete contract documentation, discuss the arrangement with my commanding officer, and ensure that my military obligations can be properly integrated with corporate responsibilities. If everything aligns appropriately, I could begin in 8 weeks. They shook hands, and Blackwood realized that he had just made one of the most unconventional hires of his distinguished career. As Chen returned to barracks, checking his watch to ensure punctual return to duty, Blackwood remained in the park, already planning how to leverage his new asset's extraordinary capabilities. 8 months later, Meridian Industries International revenues had increased by 52%, with successful entry into 7 new markets that had previously been considered too culturally complex to navigate profitably. And every weekend, tourists at Buckingham Palace could still observe Lance Corporal David Chen standing guard, though now they whispered about the million-pound soldier who had never abandoned his principles, proving that some values truly cannot be purchased. They can only be honored with integrity and discipline as the terms of engagement.